Good Yantev, Gmar Chatima Tova. What a year it's been. You know, it's a strange year when you're, as happened earlier in the service, you're talking and someone who's in Canada can hear you, but those who are 10 feet away from you can't. Can you hear me close by? Can you hear me far away? Years ago, I met a Holocaust survivor. She was the mother of a friend of our family's, and I got to know her over the course of several meals around the Jerusalem table, Friday night celebration. Her name, Kato Kraus. And as I got to know her, I found out about her story. She was a daughter of a rabbi back in Hungary before the war. She was a descendant of great rabbinic lineages. Rashi was one of her descendants. Rashi, the French rabbi, winemaker. And she lived in this small little Hasidic community in Hungary to these very observant parents, but she had this amazing talent for art. So at 16 years old, right, this could be the new shtisel, but even despite of how unusual it was, her parents accepted to send her to Budapest to study in one of the great schools in Budapest. And there her art teachers were so impressed by her, they thought this was an immense talent. You're this Orthodox Jewish girl. 1 month later, the Nazis came into Budapest, and at age 17, she was in Auschwitz. And she talked about after how being transported in the cattle cars and how horrible that was. Suddenly she lands there and she's separated from her mother, who's taken straight to the gas chambers, separated from her siblings. And in shock, as she's trying to figure out what's going on here, suddenly she's in the barracks wearing striped clothes with the sign above her head, Arbeit macht frei, work makes you free. She survived through unnameable horrors. We've all heard the stories. But there was also this amazing story of resilience. And that she emerged out of Auschwitz, and not long after, she found a husband, and she founded the start a family, and she had that career in art. And eventually she made her way to Canada, and her family was successful financially, and her children, wonderful, accomplished people. And she died just a few months ago, and at her funeral, her son spoke about her. And he said about her, she never understood God's role in the Holocaust and never fully forgave him for what had befallen her and her family. But despite it all, she somehow felt closeness to him and lived a life of honoring Torah and Jewish tradition, and she never turned away a poor person from her door. And this is what he said. It taught me that there is nothing superficial about life, and despite horrors and tragedy, despite experiencing the worst that human beings are capable of, an uplifting, constructive, and meaningful life could and should be led. But what I remember more than anything about her, and maybe I remember this about all Holocaust survivors who I've met throughout the days, is the look in her eyes. I mean, look in all of their eyes, a certain glint. And not necessarily the memory of pain or post-traumatic stress disorder or sadness, but somehow vitality and a presence and truth reflecting back to you, and of knowing something that most other people do not know about life. I remember when she talked, it was never boring because she always spoke truth. And whenever any of them spoke, telling their stories, it could be hard to understand because of their accents, but it was not boring. And it made me think of all those places of emphasis in our tradition. The mourner's Kaddish, right? It's not a prayer about death. There's not one place in the mourner's Kaddish where it actually mentions death. It's about Chaim, it's about life, and about days, and about the house of Israel, and about blessing from the Holy One, and peace for the house of Israel, and saying Amen, joining in all together and saying Amen. And now during the holidays, Our prayers that we add, they're not about apples and honey. It's only in the preschool. We say, Zochreinu l'chaim, melech hofetz b'chaim, kodvenu b'sefer ha'chaim, lemancha Elohim chayim. Remember us for life, sovereign who desires life. Write us in the book of life, for your sake, living God. Life, chayim, that current that animates concrete matter. And it struck me that what the survivors of the Shoah shared was an attunement, for good, for bad, but they understood the preciousness of life and the power of the life force, and they'd seen it keep them alive in the camps, and they felt it carried them on to a whole new life, despite whatever they had witnessed, to find new partners, new lives, families, careers, peace. Not always. And they bore testimony, and they still bear testimony to the preciousness of life and to the evils that human beings can do, that as well. That's part of their stories. But also to an unswerving faith in Chayim, and a living with that awareness in everyday life. And this is what being a Jew is about, and this is what Kol Nidre and Yom Kippur are about. And we see it in the stories of Abraham that we read throughout the holidays. And they're all about life, preserving life, casting away, life given. Right? Ishmael, who is cast away, but God preserves his life. He is redeemed. And the binding of Isaac, Isaac's life is doomed, but Abraham walked silently, knowing the sentence on his son's head. And when we hear that story, Abraham's the villain, right? We think, how could you do this? You who argued for the chayim of the inhabitants of Sodom and Gomorrah, who argued for their lives, how can you not argue for your son's chayim? And perhaps that debate and the struggling was silent as Abraham was fighting God from within. This is not what fathers should have to do to their children, until at the last moment God relented and overturned the decree. But however you understand that story, in the end, Isaac is not sacrificed. And so the story is really about the preservation of life, right? The power of the life force and the rejection of human beings being asked to sacrifice life for dogma, for gods, for ideology. And that is the altar that created the Jewish people. So a friend of mine is a major in the Israeli army. And he commands hundreds of soldiers. And every now and then they call him back to do reserve duty when there's something that's happening. And some years ago he was called back to the border with Gaza, and he was on Miluin, on reserve duty, overlooking an operation. I remember he said to me that Hamas, the terrorist organization, managed to hack into their fax in his unit. And they faxed over just a piece of paper. And what did it say on the piece of paper? In Hebrew it said, "You love life, but we worship death." We worship life. And the rabbis anchored the preciousness of life into every aspect of halakha, into every aspect of Jewish law. As we've been hearing over these past months, that Pikuach nefesh, saving a life, doche Shabbat, overrides Yom Kippur, overrides almost everything. And we've carried that chayim with us, we've carried that life with us through thick and thin, through so many horrible situations. Other Kol Nidres have been beset by crusades and war and pogroms and disease, moving from one place to the other, expelled from here to go there. Right, the final scene in Fiddler on the Roof, right after all of the drama that's been going on, the butchers and the tailors and the communists and the daughters and the dreams, after all of that, they have to move on, as Jews have done for so many hundreds of years. They have to move on. And the families are separated. It's no longer tenable to live in the shtetl because of the pogroms. Higi Azman, the time had come. Grab your possessions, load your cart, move again. Take the Sefer Torah with you, take the Torah scroll with you, take the Sofer, the scribe, take all the elements you need for shtetl. But the same time, watching it, you knew that it would continue, that they took the chayim with them, they took the life with them. And that could always be taken from one place to the other. And they went here, they went there, the butcher went to Chicago. But what audiences knew is that they were leaving the shtetl to start an even better life in the golden Medina, in the golden country, in success, a whole new life. As Jews had over and over, expelled from Spain, they went to start new life around the Mediterranean and thrown out of England and France. You sometimes wonder, after the destruction of the temple, when they no longer had priests, they no longer had a house for God, they no longer had a land to live in, why didn't they just become Greek and Roman? How did they find that strength to start again, to find the chayim and take it forward? And after the Holocaust, how did they find the strength to start again? How did they find the chayim to start in the land of swamps and deserts? Recently, I came across a story in the news about one of the only survivors from those attacks in Paris at the kosher supermarket about six years ago. And this is finally, after all this time, she was able to testify in court. And I've spoken about before how I was in France at that time. I was rabbiing in Marseille when there was a lockdown, different kind of lockdown, because the terrorists were on the loose. Anyhow, she was one of the survivors, and she talked about her ordeal and about everything that happened. How the man who was later identified as having pledged loyalty to ISIS entered the supermarket and murdered the people who worked there, murdered the people who were shopping there, but that somehow she survived. And he kept talking to her, and at one point a bullet whizzed past her head. But she kept talking. What he said to her, same as the facts my friend got. He said, "You Jews, you have it all wrong. You love life. We love death." She said those 4 hours are the most traumatic in her life. But then, now where is she? She's in Israel. She started a whole new career. She's a nurse. And he is dead. So what is it that has kept us starting again and again and finding that strength to start again? Chaim, our devotion to life, and bearing testimony to that through the ages. And connecting to Chaim has also been about another element, and that is about our faith in the Jewish people, our faith that our people has a purpose and mission in this world that we can carry with us, and our faith in the God of Israel. And on Kol Nidre, the way we begin is by bearing witness to the spiritual life within this congregation. We take out all of our Torahs, we gather. That's the life of our congregation. And we call on all the tribunals, heavenly, earthly. We annul all of our promises. We begin with a new slate, take one more step in our journey towards creating the world that God intended for us to create. And then we finish at the end of Yom Kippur, tomorrow. Seems far away, but not so far. We say the Shema once. We say the Baruch Shem 3 times, and then we say Adonai Hu HaElohim, the Lord, He is God. And we say it again, and again, and again, and again, and again, and again, 7 times. And the verse, the Lord He is King, comes from an episode, the Lord He is God, comes from an episode in biblical history from the book of Kings. Another period of darkness where the people, this is about 2,700, 2,800 years ago, right? Even back then they were going through difficulties. And the northern tribes that turned away from the worship of God and were under the influence of other nearby kingdoms. And the king of Israel, Ahab, was married to Jezebel, a princess from Sidon. And she had all the prophets of the Lord killed except for just a few. And set against her was the prophet Elijah, the same Elijah who comes to our seders and to our brisses. He had a day job back then. And Elijah won several battles against Jezebel and Ahab. And then he challenged them to this spiritual battle at the top of Mount Carmel near Haifa in the north of Israel. And it was him alone against hundreds and hundreds of priests of Baal and Asherah. And he said, let us see who the real God is. And they placed an ox. They each had to place an ox and see if they could bring fire down from the heavens. And whoever could bring fire down from the heavens, their God was the true God. And the people would bear witness. So the priests of Baal started, and they cried and they screamed to their God. And when it did not work, the priests of Baal cut themselves, right? They cut into their chayim. They hurt themselves. But nothing happened. So Elijah mocked them. What happened to your God? Is he sleeping or something? And finally it was Elijah's turn. He poured water on top of the sacrifice to really show how powerful his God was. He did it 3 times. Then he simply prayed to the living God, and fire descended and licked up the whole sacrifice up to the sky, says the story. And then all the people bowed low, and they said, the Lord, he is God, Adonai hu Elohim. Because it was one of those moments where the people found their faith again. In the midst of the worst darkness, in the midst of everything going wrong, in the midst of it all, they said, I found my faith in our people, that we have a special mission in the world, and that we have a God, and our mission is dependent on our unity. We have to find our unity again. And they made that proclamation. And this has happened so many times throughout our people's history, where we've refound our faith and reclaimed our faith. Back in April, when the pandemic, where it was just starting and everything was unknown, the whole world was in lockdown. So I sent a video out to the congregation. It was a powerful video of a man in Israel on his balcony. I don't know how many of you saw that one. He's on his balcony at night, and he has speakers lined up all around his balcony. Right here, we're not the only ones who got new audio-visual equipment during COVID. Thanks to everybody who was able to make that happen. And he turned his speakers all the way up, and he chants out in this beautiful Sephardic chant to the whole night around him. He says, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. There's a few moments silence, and suddenly you hear coming from all directions, from the night around him, people saying, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. All these voices, there were all these high rises around him. Then he pauses and he says, Adonai hu Elohim, the Lord, he is God, as we say at the end of Yom Kippur. And literally you could hear hundreds of people, invisible voices coming through the night, a choir of voices answering him, Adonai hu Elohim. Then instead of even more feeling, the Lord, he is God. And he answered his invisible community from the night, the Lord, he is God. And this is what we're doing here tonight and tomorrow. We're refining our age-old treasure, the preciousness of life, and bearing testimony to that preciousness, one of our core values. And the Hasidic master Shlomo Verdamps teaches that the true meaning of that verse that we insert into our prayers throughout the holidays, Zochreinu l'chaim, melech hafetz b'chaim, remember us for life, O King who desires life, is that the divine, that God wants his divine livingness to spread throughout the entire world. And that's why he's created all of us, human beings, to be the chosen instruments to bring that divine livingness throughout. And our task, therefore, is to carry that life, and to constantly grow and evolve as he or she desires, that we become ever larger vessels to carry that life force, and compassion and mercy and goodness. And that is not too difficult this year, because it's been Yom Kippur for 6 months, since March. We see it. We've been taken to our limit to discover what is real and what is transitory in our lives, to know what we want to keep and what do we want to cast away. Hopefully, so that we can also say, as those who came before us, that we understand what Chaim is, that we really understand what life is about and what the preciousness of life is about, and that we know too how to carry it forward. And that we also are here amidst the darkness to reignite our faith, especially in the darkness, to reignite our faith as we gather here together. From all over Chicago, from River Forest and Oak Park, and Berwyn, Riverside and Elmhurst and Hinsdale and Naperville, and throughout the western suburbs and the far western suburbs and downtown, the Loop and the Golden Mile and Wrigleyville and North Chicago and Northwest Chicago and South Chicago, in Louisville, Kentucky, and Indiana, and New Orleans, and Arizona, and California, Canada, to proclaim our faith in the Jewish people and in our journey and our purpose to bring light into the world, from Isaiah to Maimonides, from Spinoza to Einstein to Ruth Bader Ginsburg. May she rest in peace. And to say, Adonai hu Elohim, the Lord, He is God. I believe in the living God and the God of life, because it is precisely when it is darkest that we have always reclaimed that we have lost or forgotten with the greatest heart. And now we can only pray that with all that is going on, however it turns out, who knows, that we will always find that great power and that great faith within us. Find our place amidst the stars in the sky, as the prophet Daniel said. The wise will shine like brightness of heavens, and those who lead many to righteousness like the stars, forever and ever. Zochreinu lechayim, melech hafetz bechayim, v'chodvenu besefer hachayim lemancha Elohim chayim. Remember us for life, sovereign who desires life, and inscribe us in the book of life, for your merit, living God. May we all merit, each one of us, wherever we are, to bring chayim, to bring life into all of your world. Good Yontiv, Gmar Chatima Tova.